Hello everyone, welcome to the Reading into Culture podcast. My name's Zara.
I'm Chris, hey.
And we're here with Amanda, who wrote the poem Requiem. Hi Amanda.
Hi.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself a little bit before we get going?
Yes. I was born in Denmark and now currently live in Canada. I have been writing since I was, I think, 14 and started taking it seriously around my mid-20s and have been writing on a pretty consecutive basis since then. I mainly write poetry. I also do music journalism as kind of like another gateway to get my writing out there. Been dabbling in Substacks the past couple of years too, but poetry is my primary love. It's where it all started. So it's the medium I take the most seriously. And yeah.
Amazing.
It's always difficult to, expand on yourself. It's difficult to describe yourself.
Yeah, no, I get that. What do you do?
So currently I am unemployed, which is not very fun. I've worked in the creative field in Vancouver for the past 3 years. So I've done everything from venue operation to music festivals to art galleries. And yeah, that's primarily what I do in like my 9-to-5 life.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very cool.
Oh, interesting.
So would you like to tell us a little bit about what you like to read and what your kind of poetic or other literary influences are, and maybe even how they can be seen in your writing?
Yeah, sure. I would say my main influences and just the literature I consume as a whole generally comes from like an American mid-century area. I love Edna St. Vincent Millay. I love E. Cummings. I love reading Henry Miller and the name Nin. I love Walt Whitman and the old guys too. I have just I just naturally really bond with American poetry, which led me to when I was like in my mid-20s and started taking it seriously. I came across an American poet, a contemporary American poet, who kind of was willing to read what I had and give me advice and give me writing exercises and really motivated me to take it seriously. And his work actually inspired me a great deal back then and now too. But there's just something in the way he wrote. It was so evident that he had gone to multiple writing classes, had done his master's in it, and just really took it seriously. He gave me a long reading list to read, and he was a huge influence for me. But I would say I just primarily naturally just read anything that's mid-century, anything that feels a little bit out of time. I really want to get into reading more contemporary poetry. I feel like there's a real voice in it that is very crucial for the times right now, especially politically. But just on a true fundamental basis, I just love natural poetry. I love poetry that centers around the now, around nature, around like primal human emotions. And I do think that kind of comes across in my poetry in general. I like to exercise the now, and I like to take into consideration what are my immediate surroundings, what are my immediate emotions, and kind of see how those two things can marry in a poem.
That's so cool. Would you like to tell us the name of the poet who kind of mentored you in that way?
Yes, I might butcher it's funny because he lived in Denmark for a little bit, and his last name is Baldwin legally, but then I think he changed his name to the Danish translation of Baldwin, which is Skelvin. So it might be difficult for people to, how is that spelled? But it is Nicholas Skelvin. That's his, he uses. Very influential on me.
We'll have to check him out, definitely.
Yeah.
I just said the same thing.
He's a great poet.
Yeah, no, that sounds so cool that you were like mentored by someone, and to take it seriously is, I think, is a great way to say it. And I find it interesting what you said about kind of nature poetry and emotions and stuff, because it is kind of true that is kind of out of fashion. And I think there's so many things that literature and poetry especially has done in the past that is kind of out of fashion now, that is actually really great and really amazing. But when you do write in that way, it can come across as, as kind of, not really of the culture right now. So that's really cool. I think that you kind of still do that because you like it.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well then, would you like to maybe introduce the poem and then read it out for us? If you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
Amazing.
I have it prepared.
Amazing.
So the poem is called Requiem. It's a poem I actually began, I think, 2.5 years ago, my first spring in Vancouver. So it looks very different now to how it used to look. It's been rewritten every spring.
I love that.
But it was just like growing up in Denmark, you don't really get to see a lot of like majestic nature around you. So having my first spring in Vancouver and seeing the mountains and just how natural everything felt, and it was quiet, and it was just the most beautiful spring I've ever come across. There was something in that environment that inspired me to write kind of a requiem for the life I had left behind, but also just like a time and a place when I felt probably at my worst and just was so eager to move away. And sometimes you find yourself in some type of state where all you want is just to escape that state, but you have no resources, no energy, no incentives to do it. And then standing in Vancouver in spring was just like, whoa, I actually did it. So that's kind of what inspired the poem. But it does rewrite itself every year, just because it's not a feeling I want to linger in. So this is my most latest edition of the poem.
That's so cool that you kind of keep reworking it every spring.
It's almost spring again, so time for a new version.
Perfect for the spring 2025, 2026 edition as well.
Exactly. That's what we're thinking. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay, perfect. The crescent moon in January, the geese that flew above me in February, the gentleman who read Graham Greene on a stool by the corner shop, they all feel hidden away in the fog blown down Mount Grouse this morning. Laughter is in the cherry blossom, loss is sea foam at the beach, and the afternoon strikes up a conversation of formations, so I dance with the snowdrops popping with care around my street. At every uprise, I sense their glee, so I prevent myself from picking them. It is so magical to be in this illusion where time only spans across March, April, and May. Last spring, I wrote eulogies for the time I spent among zucchini blossoms and imagined a requiem read out loud when I laid among these zucchini blossoms. Nothing feels like skin like their flowers. My mother birthed a poet when hazels and anemones sprung. Magnolias, daffodils, daisies, and thistle all scream in ecstasy whenever I grow older, but only now do I feel this need to rise. I worship rebirth. It is one of many reasons I am so fond of spring. So I'll melt away in the orange light of tomorrow's early morning with celibacy and celebration. It is a triumph to breathe for full day.
Thank you.
Amazing, yeah. It's very well read. It's a really, really wonderful poem. Thank you so much for reading it for us. First thing that kind of strikes me about this poem is obviously this idea of rebirth and spring, right? That's what the poem is on the surface level about. And I guess my question is, what does you worship rebirth. What does rebirth mean to you?
I mean, in the classical sense, I understand it as things coming back to life, which is why spring is such a good metaphor to use. A little bit corny sometimes, but if it can be reworked in an original way, it's always very fascinating reading.
Yeah.
But on a personal level, it for me always feels like an inner feeling of self-accomplishment, or a sense of joy, or just like I feel like personal rebirth is such a difficult feeling to describe. It's so subjective to everyone. For me, with this poem in particular, and with lots of my poetry, it is, as someone who has moved across the world many times and struggled to find purpose and to find ideas and creativity, and just kind of been waiting for things to spark up again. Once it does, it kind of feels like a rebirth. It feels like some type of rebirth of the mind and the soul, because you just exist so much of your life in this like shell-like state where you just don't really, engage with the world or with yourself. And then it becomes really difficult to feel like you are living. So that feeling of being reborn, even in like a small sense, and even just at home, is kind of a really intense feeling. And sometimes it's not very visible. It's the same when spring isn't usually very visible until we notice small flowers bloom in the street, or the weather changing, things like that. So I just thought those two things kind of mirrored each other. It was something I was thinking about a lot that particular spring.
Very interesting, very interesting.
I find it so interesting because the first time you read the poem, or the first time I read the poem, let's not generalize, I was kind of struck by the title, and then the poem feels so kind of peaceful almost, like when you first read it.
Yeah.
And then you read it again and you take the title into account and you kind of see the themes, and then I realized that there's so much death in this poem. There's rebirth as well, but for rebirth to happen, there has to be a death first, and there's loss, there's eulogies, there's the Requiem, and just generally, there's a lot of Catholicism in this poem as well. There's, the Mass for the Dead. There's celibacy, which is more of a Catholic thing. There's also Graham Greene, who's a Catholic, and I was wondering about that. Do you have a history with Catholicism, or even if you don't, is that something that you're kind of interested in, or that influences the way that you view the world?
It's actually interesting you say that. I grew up extremely atheist and didn't know any people of religion really. But a lot of the people I was engaging with when I first moved to Canada were Catholic or Roman Catholic, and had grown up extremely Christian. And the thing with Graham Greene especially, it was this very specific guy that worked at my corner shop and would always just read Graham Greene. And I thought it was like a maybe performative thing, or like he's just reading it to read it or something. But it was because of like a personal bond with Graham Greene. And Catholicism and religion in general was something I was thinking about a lot, because it was the first time I felt like I was really introduced to it, and had to navigate in a city and with people that took religion into account all the time, and how it also influenced the cityscape and the landscape. And so I think it kind of subconsciously came out, and I only noticed it much later that it kind of had this image of Catholicism, or like like a death mass, because when you like, I was trying purposefully to write it in a very peaceful way, because maybe I associate death and requiems with this like peaceful, natural ascend into the heavens, or I don't know, but just like that death is natural and it's beautiful and it's celebrated. But in religious practices, it is typically very dramatic and often deserves like a very theatrical, dramatic, emotional narrative. And I kind of purposefully, in my fourth rewrite, I think, try to put that a little bit in there. So it's interesting that it was noticed. I don't think anyone has ever noticed that.
I sorry, can I just say something? I find it so. This is one of the things that I love about writing, is that there are things of you in everything you write without you even realizing, and it happens so often that you put themes into things and you don't even know. You don't even notice that they're there, and someone has to actually look at the words you've written, because sometimes if you're the writer, you're the worst person to actually read the words, because they're just so burnt into your brain that you can't really see them anymore for what they are. And you need someone else to read them. And I've had that experience many times where, we study creative writing, where you bring a piece of creative writing into a class or into a situation, or even two friends, and then they say, oh, this has this theme or this idea, and you're like, oh, it does? But I've been thinking about that all the time, but I didn't know that it actually made its way in there. Or even when you write fiction, there is so much of the writer in each bit of fiction, and it's actually embarrassing. You can write about someone who's completely different from you, and you're just all over the page. And so that's really funny and kind of relatable that happened to you, that something you were thinking about just ended up in the poem and you didn't even realize it.
Yeah, totally.
I find that quite striking that nobody has kind of noticed the religious nature of the poem before, because the worshipping of rebirth is the central idea of not only Catholicism but of kind of Christianity and even other religions. It's a kind of to worship rebirth. It strikes me very, very. It's a deeply Christian idea, and so I find that very striking. And that was going to be my question, one of my questions, which I think you have in some ways already answered. But so this if rebirth is conceived in this poem as a god or a deity of some kind, and there's in some ways seems to be a very benevolent god that brings a lot of joy and good things, for lack of a better term, but also quite a dark god, because a rebirth is death. So there's a kind of, that was going to be one of my questions, is this some kind of god of death, or is this a kind of, is this a benevolent god? Is kind of, if you follow what I mean here, like,
I follow what you mean.
Is rebirth it's a complicated thing in this poem, what rebirth is, whether it's a joyous experience or whether it's a mournful experience, and to what extent it's both. And I guess that's kind of where my question is going slowly. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, rebirth is, or death in itself, is just such a extremely sensitive topic to write about, because it's just like the one thing in life we can't predict or control or theorize about, at least really, because it's so unnatural to us as living creatures that there's such a thing as death. And I find, at least for me, I think a lot of people do, if we kind of go in and out between, is death like a scary thing? Is it not a scary thing? Is it natural and peaceful and beautiful? Or is it this catastrophic end to this life that is all I've known? And when I think about death, I always kind of think back to uni, when I was doing environmental science and marine biology, I took this like weird class on animal ethics where we were discussing for weeks what constitutes a conscious being. Is it all humans? Is it all humans plus animals? Is it all humans plus animals plus plants? And it made me really think about how we can feel extreme remorse and sadness for another person dying or a dog dying, or but not so much a little daffodil in the street or a seagull or things like that. So we have this like natural build-up idea of what deserves death and what death is, and is it natural and just kind of the natural way to go for the seagull and the daffodil, but is it this catastrophic thing for us because we are on a higher level of consciousness or whatever? Like it's just these conversations I have with myself when I just exist and when I write. But I think the poem also is meant to hint that death is this beautiful natural thing that happens, and rebirth happens kind of generally in like your usual way of living and just throughout your periods of change in your life, but also just as brutalist nature imaging. I want it to be like a conversation of what is death. So I've rewritten it so many times, so it's like I always think back to the versions where it didn't include so much death and when it included a lot of death. But the poem as it exists right now, this rewrite, I really wanted it to kind of have this doubling of how death can be beautiful and natural, but also, and that kind of ties back to with the thing of God. Like, is God evil? Is it like is death like a God-fearing thing, or is it like a God-loving thing? Like, do we give ourselves naturally to a God if there is a God? And yeah, I think it can just go on and on, this conversation, because there's so many layers to it. But I think you get what I'm trying to convey with this. Sorry, I went a bit of a tangent there.
No, not at all.
Please always do.
That was directly not. I think it was very, very interesting indeed, directly relevant. I think. I think that's very interesting. What you say when you mentioned the multiple draft of the poem, because I think that's very, very meaningful, because that's kind of the poem is in itself reborn with the spring every year, and I think that's one thing I wanted to maybe think about was this. Last spring I wrote eulogies for the time I spent among the zucchini blossoms. That those couple of lines I find interesting, that what's different about this spring, and then now with you saying that about how the poem is redrafted every spring, that brings out a certain kind of meta commentary on the process of writing the poem. Perhaps a kind of, this is a poem that will always be written and always have to be written every single spring, and this kind of, it's always going to be about something different, but it is always going to be the same almost.
Yeah, I found time in this poem very interesting as well, because it's like it starts with January and then February, as if that's kind of the past, and then this is the last spring, and then this morning. So when is this morning? Because we go from kind of the past memories to the now. And it's interesting when you said about that you are particularly interested in writing about the now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think before I moved to Vancouver, or just like in my teenage years and my early 20s, I struggled a lot with writing about the now, because it became so melancholic, and my poetry back then was just so, like, for lack of a better word, self-pitying and very very dramatic, very sad, and very in the past. So it became a huge thing for me to try and write more presently. And I remember that specific morning when the poem started forming in my head. I was walking to work and passed this lovely gentleman who read Graham Greene, and it was a foggy morning, but it was still kind of light and like very pretty. It just felt like time was standing still. And it really made me think about like, whoa, this is like such a moment in itself. I could write a poem about this. And then it started slowly, and I just kept kind of coming back to the moment of walking to work and seeing the fog. Like the mountains in Vancouver are so incredibly beautiful, and you can always see snow on the mountaintop. You can always see fog if it's foggy. And sometimes if it's like a perfectly clear day, you can see clouds and fog just kind of come down the mountain. And it felt like I'm not religious, but I love to use the phrase like it's kind of like seeing God or seeing the eye of God. And it felt kind of just holy. So I just wanted to include that specific moment in the poem, no matter how many times I've been rewriting it. And yeah, it was like, I think a mid-March day. And yeah, it just felt like, it kind of felt like I forgot everything that had happened up until that March day. And I didn't even really remember what had happened the last month or that January, because time was just like moving, you know, as time does. And things just felt so ordinary. But that day was just so visible to me. And it really became a good way for me to practice writing about the now, even though the poem is also kind of melancholic and it talks about the past. Because I think it's important to understand, like I can't at least understand the now without understanding why the now is different from the past. So whenever I write and whenever I rewrite this, I always try to take that into account, that if I am to write about the present or any type of feeling or whatever I'm feeling right now, I have to understand why it feels different. And I think that's a really good skill to have, not just with writing, but just like in general. It's like it's a really magical feeling once you understand how things are different now than they were in the past. And which is kind of ironic because I write so much about nature and like take so much influence from old-fashioned poetry, but kind of try to have just a little bit of a contemporary lens. Like, how is this different from now? Like, why does it feel outdated now? But why does it also work?
I would like to ask you a question about your writing, just more generally. So what kind of strikes me about the way that you talk about writing poetry, it seems very process oriented rather than outcome oriented, and neither one is better or worse. But that makes me wonder, what do you look for in a poem that you write, actually in the outcome? What are kind of like maybe poetic principles or markers of quality that when you write, that is kind of what you try to include to make the outcome, you know, a good poem?
Yeah. I mean, it's I struggle with, a lot of people ask me this, and I always just struggle with it because I've never had any formal training in writing. And I really should have. I should not have gone to uni for environmental science. I should have gone to creative writing. But
well, you had a mentor as well.
That's the thing. Like, I did not know anything about any type of like writing principles or what to look for or how to identify a good poem or how to even identify how I want my poem to look like before I met him. And he really made me think about it so much. And I still, 8 years later, think about it. And he was really, back then I was very like, oh yes, tell me everything you know. But now I try to be very conscious of like, that's his writing identity, that's his perspective, that's how he writes the best. It does not necessarily have to translate to me. but it still is solid advice. Like he was very like, because he asked me, how do poems come about for you? And I told him that for me it has always been and still is just words kind of form in my head like zucchini blossom, or like I know I want to write about zucchini blossoms. I know I want to write about the fog from this morning. I want to write about that particular time I felt like this because it felt grand or whatever. Um, and then things just naturally start forming in my head. And he was like, okay, just take time to write down everything that you think is related to that feeling or that moment or that word. Come up with adjectives, come up with stories that can relate to it, and see if you can puzzle piece your way to it. And then once you do that, rewrite, edit the ton out of it, get rid of unnecessary words, all just like the classic writing advice. And then once I felt like I had the perfect draft to show him, he was like, no, edit it again. And then it just became like this, in the end, stripped back version of what I originally had imagined. And it kind of took me away from wanting to make the poetry sound or look a certain way. And it gave me less expectations on myself and the poems. So after years of trying to practice that, I've just kind of become kind of content with just the fact that I want my poetry to just kind of reflect what the initial idea was. Because for me, it is, as you said, it is such a process thing. It's not so much about the outcome. And I know a lot of people who, like in Vancouver where I'm at, I have been hosting poetry shows every month for the past 2 years, I think. And we have poets of all capacities come in to read. And I can tell that they want their poetry to be a certain way, and they almost want to categorize it before it's even fully finished. And I do try to encourage people to just like let the process be the fun part of it. I know it's not for everyone, but it is, at least for me. I think it makes you more present with the poetry. I think it makes you a little bit more attached to your writing if you just go through it in a natural process instead of thinking about the outcome. But I think as long as you keep the final product related to the initial idea, that's, at least for me, like all I can ask for. Because I go through so many rewrites and edits because it's been hammered into my head, just edit it again and again and again and again. So it's even difficult for me to think of any of my poems as finished.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
They always feel never ending, always on an editor's table.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. I do think the process determines the outcome in a lot of ways, right? Obviously, so there is no process without outcome, and there is no outcome without process, right? You need to do something to make something. You need to make something. You have to have done something. And so I think even if you are entirely focused on the process, that process leads to an outcome.
Yeah.
And even if you are entirely focused on an outcome, that outcome is only created by a process. So
then it's not a binary.
Yeah, exactly. And also just like the process is so important. The kind of how you write determines what you write. I think so. I think the process is very, very important. And so, like, for example, if you go outside to write your poems, then you're going to write a very different poem than if you stay at home and write on the desk. That's just is how it is going to be, I think, for the vast majority of writers. Like, the process is so important. So I think it's very good to focus on that. I find that very wise, to be honest.
What do you do when you feel like all of your edits just make it worse? Because I feel like I definitely 100% agree that editing is super, super important, and but I don't think I'm quite as radical as you as you. And I often feel like when I have to kind of tinker around with it too much, something is lost. And maybe it isn't, maybe that's just an illusion, maybe actually it does become better because you're kind of maybe attached to the original version, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But what do you think?
Oh, I mean, I have maybe thousands of poems that have never gotten anywhere because they've been to death, and I have to force myself just to leave it. Otherwise, I go crazy. For myself, I try to, if I feel like I'm not getting anywhere, or I'm just like, all I do is just edit, I try to just write something completely different to force my head out of the poetic world, because sometimes I just get lost on like one word, like how do I describe this one thing perfectly with just one word, and then I can just like I can't sleep because I'm just up all night thinking about it. And then I'm like, okay, let me write I don't know, an essay about sex, just to kind of take myself away from it. Because I feel like you absolutely can just almost kill your own writing just with editing. Editing is so important, but sometimes it's just like, I don't know. I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that maybe some poems are just not meant to be, and maybe it's just it just needs to be left as an idea, and maybe 6 months down the line it can be picked up again and be reworked into something new. But I don't know, it's difficult. Poetry is such a part of you as a person. It's such a part of your identity if you do write poetry, and it's difficult to part with. Kind of, it's like stopping to work on a painting, or like it's not fun. But you can just redirect that energy. That, at least for me, always works.
That's interesting. You said that you kind of want the poem to still stay with a kind of central idea, you know.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm thinking about is, in my mind, there's kind of two ways. Seeing writers, there's kind of two ways. Poets, especially, there's kind of two ways poets go about it. Like, either you start with the language, you start with some kind of phrase that you kind of have in your head, and you try and figure out, you write that down, then later you try and figure out what the poem's about.
Yeah.
Or you start with a kind of idea of what the poem is about, and then you try and find the right words to describe it. And I guess that's interesting that, so what you say for you is more like you have an idea of what the poem's about, and then you are trying to find the right language.
Yeah.
Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, kind of. Definitely wasn't always like that, but at least lately, it's I don't know. It's so wild to talk about poetry in this way, because it's just such a, like with any skill, it's just something you always kind of come in and out of. I feel like sometimes I'm a really strong writer, sometimes I feel like I'm a horrible writer, and
absolutely.
And it's like I feel like I can't write poetry well unless I'm also writing something else. At least like I have to kind of write some essays. If I write like an essay for someone else, I don't feel like that contributes to my personal creativity. But I need to have other writing projects for myself, just to kind of keep reinventing myself, because it's difficult to kind of come up with a language after you know what you want to write about.
Yeah, that's very true.
It's really, really difficult, and I wish I was born with just like a natural talent to communicate beautifully and accurately every time I want to write about something. But like, such few people do that.
Do you ever write anything in Danish?
Oh, I used to, but I actually think it's a shame. I really want to get back to it. I think Danish can be beautiful. I don't think it is beautiful, but it can be. There's some really beautiful words. But obviously, being in Canada, no one can read Danish. So over here, it at least doesn't make sense. But sometimes I do feel like just writing a few poems in Danish, just because I feel like I'm losing my Danish a lot. There's like a lot of words that I just simply cannot remember because I never use them. And I think at least to kind of get back in touch with my native language, I would like to write some Danish poems, but I just don't know for who. And then it becomes a whole question of, well, should it be for anyone? Shouldn't it just be for you?
Yeah.
And that is exhausting in itself.
Yeah, there's a simple thing like that leading to like an existential crisis that's very relatable.
That's very interesting because you're German and you never write in German.
Yeah, I was born in Germany, grew up in Germany, and just lived here my whole life until I was 19. And I think I've maybe attempted like 3 poems in German.
Yeah.
And I had that same feeling of like, I really should read in German. I should get into German literature. There's so many people who would kill to speak German to be able to read everything that's out there.
Yeah.
And I really should, you know, and I think I kind of had to let go of that and embrace the fact that I am more interested in English literature than German literature, and I'm more interested in writing in English than in German, and feel like I can express myself better in writing and enjoy it more. Yeah. And maybe I always say, you know, I'm still young. Maybe one day, you never know. But I don't know. I think for my sanity, I had to kind of let go of that.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. I think there's something a bit. I struggle to communicate this to my Canadian peers, but there's like for me sometimes it's like a bit of an embarrassment, because I can speak both languages, so I can compare both languages, and not German, but Danish and English.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just feel like, oh, this word in English is so beautiful and it just holds so much weight, but the Danish word is just so heavy, and like it almost feels like an embarrassment to write using those words, because they, for us, are just so ingrained in us, and it reminds us of our parents or upbringing and a childhood, and then it becomes like a whole layer of like embarrassment, because we all go through embarrassment in our childhood and teenage. And I can kind of feel like, I just don't really want to return to that. But maybe it is also just like an interest. Maybe some people are just meant to write in English, even if they're not native English speakers. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like so many people who aren't native English speakers, I feel like there's so many people that feel this way, that expression in English is somehow easier and somehow feels more allowed almost. And I really like, what does it feel like if you only have the option to write in your native language?
Yeah.
Is there something about English that makes it easier, or is it the emotional kind of distance that you have from your native language? Because like I need some studies about this, because what's going on with that, because it really is a phenomenon, I feel like.
No, well, it's interesting because I speak German fluently, not as well as you speak English, but I would always write in English. I would never think about, I'm British, by the way. I would never think about writing in German, even though I probably could give it a go, but it's just my English. I speak English better. I can communicate better in English because that's my native language, and you two obviously are much better at English than I am at German, but I'm fluent in German, and I don't know, I just always wrote in English. I wouldn't think about changing it. And I guess maybe there's like a cachet and a prestige to English. That it's kind of the language of the world.
Yeah.
So maybe that's part of it too. Like as you say, like there's a lot. If you even Canada, people don't speak Danish, so you'll write in English. There's almost nowhere in the world where where people wouldn't be able to read some English if you wrote it in that. So maybe, I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah. It is interesting because I would never think about writing in German. Like I would never do that.
Yeah.
So it's not just a kind of, maybe there's like a mystique to a second language. It kind of adds a power to the words because they don't feel so familiar and every day. But
maybe it's just the Germans and the Danish are kind of repressed.
Just the Central Europeans. Yeah, could be. Imagine the Dutch and Swedish are the same, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, it totally is. Like, I think there's such a, in general, a romanticism and an exoticism with foreign languages, and I think people in Europe, especially Northern Europeans who are so good at English, just tend to romanticize English as is, like, as you said, language of the world. Everyone can understand it. It's this like universal way of speaking, and it's been hammered into our heads from when we were children with the movies we watch and the books we read, and everything cultural is in English, and it just becomes this like way of communicating with everyone in a way that doesn't feel very rooted in maybe our culture. But I can't speak for Germans, but I feel like at least Danish people have lost so much of like their culture for the sake of maintaining a sort of international, like, oh, I don't know how to describe this, but
Yeah, like globalization.
yeah, it's a conversation I have with my partner all the time, because he, for the life of him, cannot understand why I would ever leave Denmark come to Canada. And he's like, oh, but it's so progressive and welfare and all these other things. And I think for us, it's just kind of, obviously it's where we grow up, and it's where we just like have had our lives up until we reach a certain age and we move on or whatever. And some people stay, but for me, it's just like there's such a loss of language and culture and music and books and in, at least in Denmark, that I didn't feel like I was very connected to it. And I think it's more difficult for people to leave places that have a huge cultural like mirror to how they live, and like places like Pakistan or China that have like thousands of years worth of literature and folk music that is still very much alive. I think it becomes very embedded in their way of living, and then their culture becomes a part of their identity. But at least for me and the people I grew up around, like nothing Danish is embedded into us other than just the language. And then it just doesn't feel like there's anything at risk in writing in Danish or making music in Danish. Like no musicians in Denmark sing in Danish, really. Like I haven't been there a few years. Maybe they do now, but when I was teenager, no one did.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That's very interesting. I think I can relate to this to a certain extent, but not as much as you. I think for me it's also kind of the things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
People don't know about that in the way that even when I lived in England for a few years or in Australia, people are way more, the average person is way more aware of literature and poetry, and young people read literary fiction and even poetry and sometimes, and in my world, I'm also not from such a big city, so maybe it has something to do with that, but like in my world, nobody knows even the first thing about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Nobody engages with that. It's nobody's hobby. It's people get a book for their vacation and then they read it and then that's it. So I kind of felt the cultural disconnect there as well, about kind of my passion.
Yeah.
I don't know if you felt the same in Denmark, and I don't know if at the time when you were living there you were kind of already into poetry and felt this way, or I don't know if that rings true to you.
Yeah, it kind of does. I think just anyone growing up in a small town kind of feel a certain type of alienation when they have a hobby that's kind of outside the norm, which is weird because writing and reading is not outside the norm, but it
right.
it can be. And I think especially in my little small town, it was all about pop music and drinking and smoking and going to parties and playing handball. That was kind of just that was everything we did, and no one read poetry. No one understood any of my references. I was always just really weird to them. And I always thought it was so strange because like everything we consume comes from books and reading and writing. No musician makes anything without writing a piece of music or writing lyrics. No movie has come from nothing. Someone needs to write it. And yeah, I just thought it was really strange. It really wasn't until I moved to Canada that I found other people who were interested in it. I did do a short stint in Copenhagen before I moved to Canada, where I volunteered with the Copenhagen Poetry House, and we tried to recruit poets. And it was really difficult because no one, like, people were interested in it to a certain extent, and people were writing poems to a certain extent, but most people we kind of tried to recruit to come and read and engage with us, they already had this like defeatist attitude about it, because poetry especially, but all sorts of writing, has become elitist, and no one really wanted to engage with it because they were like, what's the point? Because like I'm never going to get discovered and no one's ever going to take my poetry seriously, and we already have like X amount of poets that have made it, so really what's the point? And I think that's such a shame. Like it's like art in general is not meant to be for the elite, and it's not meant to be this like pick and choose game of who deserves to be heard and who deserves to be recognized. It's I think it's such bullshit, but unfortunately it has really influenced the literary world in Europe specifically, not so much in Canada. There's hardly any literary scene here, but at least that also removes the elitism from it. But yeah, I think the elitism also just kind of has a lot to do with it, at least in Copenhagen.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
So, like elitism is maybe more generally more of a presence in Europe, especially in kind of Britain and Germany, the countries I know about, than maybe in the New World.
Yeah,
they don't quite have the same kind of old aristocratic kind of ideas about these things that maybe we do in Europe. I don't know. But I feel like this brings us pretty wonderfully to the kind of the last question of the podcast that we always do, about the role of writing in poetry in the culture now. So I think we should do that, because I think we're kind of already touching on those topics. So so yeah, Amanda, what would you say is the place of writing or poetry in the culture now?
Any and all thoughts, any and all perspectives. You don't have to have a neat answer. It's a very complex question.
Any and all thoughts. It's actually something I think about a lot, because I do.
Me too.
I think a lot of writers do. I think especially because I do produce these monthly poetry shows, and I do get a lot of poets that come in that have something very current to say. They write about Palestine. They write about oppression. They write about gender inequality, misogyny, all these things that feel very of the now, so to speak, like the cultural now at least, because we've at least finally reached a point where it's no longer taboo to talk openly about these issues. But and it's not to say that it's a bad thing at all. I think absolutely there's a place in writing for that. But it also, I've noticed, at least here in Vancouver, it has kind of overtaken all other sorts of poetry, which I think is really interesting, because it, like, for hundreds of years, no marginalized group was ever allowed to openly talk about things, were not allowed to read about it or write about it or have any type of communication with non-marginalized groups about it. And I think it's interesting that it's come to a point where these current issues and having your eyes open and being engaged and being active in the debate is becoming this like indicator of being also culturally active. And I think it's a really interesting time in literature right now, because I see who gets these like huge breaks in the Copenhagen literary world, where it's always about picking this like urban kid who's straight out of prison to write about his voice, which is super, super important. But it almost becomes a little bit of like almost like the elite is handpicking all these marginalized people to have their voices, and then that kind of just becomes the trend. And I think once something becomes a trend, it will inevitably also become unpopular at some point. And I think it's interesting that for so long literature has been about ideas and fantasy and nonfiction and like all these different things, and now it's so related to politics and opinions and identities and expression in a way we've never really seen before. And I think with it becoming such a trend, it's like it makes me fear that all these people that now finally have a voice will soon not have a voice, because it's been hyped up to be this like thing in the cultural zeitgeist that is kind of overtaking everything else with the best intentions. And then at some point it's just going to not have the like people are not going to have the best intentions with this type of literature. And then I'm going on a complete tangent that might not make a lot of sense, but it's just something I talk so much about with the poets in Vancouver, because there's absolutely also a handful of people that just write poetry for the sake of writing poetry and because they enjoy it. And sometimes they come up to me after the poetry shows and they're like, oh, I don't know if this place is for me because I don't really have a voice. And I'm like, you don't need to have a voice. You can also just come read because you want to. You also don't have to read. You can also just come listen. And I think, I don't know, I think literature in itself is in a weird spot right now, because we finally have created this voice for a lot of people, but at the same time it also just doesn't really feel like it matters. Like with how the state of the world is, it's just nothing really seems to matter. And we can scream and scream and scream all we want, but nothing is really like, there used to be a time when culture really defined society, and I don't know if that's true anymore, which is really scary. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not making sense anymore, but
no, you totally are. You totally are.
I think you're really putting into words how I also feel that, you know, we can write and we can publish and we can read and nobody cares. Yeah. And this actually reminds me of there's a poetry festival every year in Cologne that we went to last year, and there was an Icelandic poet. Do you remember his name?
Sjön. I don't know how to pronounce it.
And I thought he was actually a really, really good poet. And he had some great poems. But he was a very kind of typical poet. Like, he was kind of an older white man, you know, and kind of a little bit serious. And he said, only poetry can save the world. And I thought that was so ridiculous. And other people, the other poets who were speaking at the event, they said, no, first of all, it can't. And second of all, even if it could, it won't. I think it's such a, you know, people who do a certain kind of art, they always think this is the one that really matters. Poetry is the thing that really is the thing that's going to save the world. Yeah. And the truth is, we can write all the poems we want and they don't care. you know, the world doesn't really become significantly better. And obviously it would be worse if we weren't writing the poems, but that's kind of, I do struggle with that idea as well of what is the point of writing and of writing poetry if the world doesn't really care about it and it's not going to change anything. And I don't even write particularly political poems, I wouldn't say. Obviously, I mean kind of, but not in the way where maybe almost like slam poetry that kind of makes a point that is being read out at a protest is, you know. But even that kind of poetry, it feels almost a little kind of self-congratulatory. It's like you kind of make a stance to the people who already think usually the way that you do, and the whole world moves on and lives another day, and what was it really for?
Yeah.
And I don't want this to sound mean at all, but this is just kind of an existential question that plagues me, you know. I don't mean to insult anybody or anything.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. It's like in Vancouver specifically, there's this huge emphasis on, at least in the cultural scene, there's a huge emphasis on community. And it seems like the general idea is that, okay, we might not, like, we're not changing the world with our writing or our scenes or the art we make, but at least it's for the community. And at least like someone in the community might resonate with what I do. And that can sometimes feel like it's enough, but I also come across those people that, you know, have that stance of like, this type of art is what's going to change all of it. Typically it's musicians.
Oh, true, yeah.
It's like, oh, music is the universal language, and sure, but I'm
it's usually just the art form that you like, that you think is the best. Exactly. Because you like it.
Exactly. I love poetry so much, but I don't want to claim that it can define things in the same way it used to. I think like there was a time when okay, now it's going to get really nerdy, but I'm researching. I'm researching for a podcast that I'm launching, God knows when, about folk music, which is my other true love in life. And I am particularly interested in North American folk music because it's extremely unique. It's formed by so many different influences from all over the world, but it also comes from a place, a lot of it comes from Europe. So a lot of my research right now is geared towards figuring out how folk music was shaped in Europe throughout the first millennia. And there was certainly a point in time in Europe, at least, where music and poetry defined so much of society and how we viewed ourselves as countries and national identities and nationalism in general. And there was so much put into making artists of all sorts these like cultural markers. And that's, I think, the last time when it was real, when literature and art in general really had something to say. And I think with this like overconsumption in the 21st century, that we can just like access everything we want now, it just, everything also just loses itself. It's just like a drop in this huge ocean of accessible art mediums, and that makes it feel both really like close to us because we can access all this, like we can discover desert music in Sahara, which we couldn't do like 100 years ago, but it also makes it less significant because it's just become like it's put on the same shelf as everything else, and then it just doesn't feel like it's very definable or it's very, it has any voice. It just kind of becomes this, a page in a book, And that can give me like huge existential crisis of like what's gonna become of art in the next 100 years, and like if we've removed all this like significance from it while also making it so attainable. It's frightening sometimes, but yeah, I think it's just a shame when there actually was a time when something could be said and it actually had an impact, because we do as humans want to believe that what we do and what we say and the opinions that we have matter, but it just doesn't really feel like it anymore. And yeah, it can make it kind of, I understand why people don't want to make their art anymore. Like I can truly understand that. Oh my god, I didn't want to end on a depressive note.
No, I think it's sometimes it needs to be done.
It is a depressing state.
But yeah, I don't know, it's tricky. It's very tricky. I don't know. I think people believe in art a lot, and I think that's good. But for me, if you're looking at it kind of in a political sense, art is neutral.
Yeah.
The Nazis that had art, they made films, they had posters, they had songs. There's a liberal tendency to view art as a necessarily left-wing thing. And I think that is false.
Yeah.
I think art can and has been deeply reactionary, deeply fascist, deeply right-wing, and is now often. And I think so that's where poetry is going to save the world. From what? Like, I'm sure there are lots of poets who if they saved the world, it would be very different from if I saved the world. And their saving the world I would consider horrific, and my saving the world they would consider horrific. You know, like politics. The right makes art too. The left doesn't own art. So that's why I kind of struggle slightly with the idea that art is going to lead to the revolution, or, you know, to express it in that kind of way. But I do think there's something about, and yeah, what you say about like, the poetry and music had this kind of role in nation formation is very true. As far as I know, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And that's like, is that good? Is that like, is the formation of these European nation states, is that something that we're happy about and what that has led to as a civilization? It obviously has led to some very good things, but it certainly isn't a neutral good. So
it's just like an identity shaping.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Maybe now it has that power a little less.
Yeah, no, it's less. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that maybe the forming of European national identities is not, from my point of view, certainly not an uncomplicated good thing. But, and I get what you both mean about this kind of, I do think especially spoken word poetry, but like live events, poetry there can be often like quite didactic, quite like, it has a message that it very clearly wants to express. And I think that could be very effective, but I think for people like me, who my main engagement with poetry is as a written form, and with a kind of slightly more canonical approach to literature, for better or worse, it can come across somehow slightly too didactic, slightly like, I think poetry is good when it is in uncertainty, when it is in ambiguity, and a poem that just has a kind of more straightforward message, even if that message, which is something that I 110% agree with, like Free Palestine, to write a poem about that feels slightly too didactic. For me, a poem needs to be slippery, needs to be somehow indirect, and maybe that's a flaw of mine, but that is kind of how I feel about it. So I share your concern. If all poetry was this kind of didactic spoken word poetry, which is what I think you're describing, I would consider that a sad thing. Luckily it isn't, but I do see what you mean totally. I don't know if maybe I misinterpreted that, but that's kind of what I understood from what you were saying.
Totally. This conversation could go on for days. Yeah, I really like the point of, art not being reserved for the left. Anyone of any side all over the world engages with art to make their point come across or make their emotions and feelings come across. And I think it's an important thing to highlight in today's society and like the cultural climate we're in right now. Something I talk about with my partner all the time, who's like a beautiful, wonderful musician, but also like a huge deadhead and very much a big fan of like the free love of the 60s and how music was so uniting back then. And he is very much of the opinion that art is the thing that will save us in the end. And again, like from what? Because yeah, I'm always just like, sure, but did it really do anything back then? Even like when it was happening, was it really that significant? It was significant to you and to other people who engage with that type of art, but anything anywhere can create a movement that can counterfeit what we are protesting or what we are advocating for. And like I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of art in general, but also what's really frightening, because I think anyone would want to believe that art is what unites us, but it's also what separates us, because it's so extremely subjective and it's so minimized and limited by the culture we exist in and the society we exist in. And it's so easy for us to sit and hypothesize what can happen to art in the future and how art looks right now, especially literature, which is, at least in my opinion, the medium that is the least funded, the least accessible, the least widespread in a sense. Like I think music is definitely up there with like just the medium that everyone naturally bonds with, and for the most part has the largest impact on society right now. But I would
that or film or television.
Film and television, absolutely. Yeah, probably mainly film and television. But I would like to see something new happen in literature, and I almost don't really care what it is, even if I'm just I'm fed up with the elite having to choose whose voice gets heard and who becomes accessible to the public, so to speak. It just rings bells to the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, when the church and the state chose who get to perform music and who it's almost like a type of like modern censorship that I really don't vibe with, and I would like to see that dismantled. I would like to see more opportunities for writers. I would like to see more grants. I would like to see all these things, while also in a way see a movement that really, 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 really dismantles the current system we're in with literature and makes room for the more slippery stuff to come in. I think we're in a period right now where poetry has become very uniform in a way. And I would very much like to not return is the wrong word, but enter a new period where creativity really gets to be the main marker for people's, like I would like to see that become the main driver of the literary world. I'm kind of over it being so based on the times, which is so stupid because I was just like moments ago talking about how I like to talk about the now. I like to write about the now. But like it I would just like to see something new happen, which I think is doable, but yeah, I don't know. I think those are my final thoughts. It's not like I'm saying anything super new, but
No, you are, definitely.
So interesting. Yeah, not a return, but a rebirth, perhaps.
yes,
Bring it back to the top.
a little rebirth, perhaps.
I totally agree with you, and this seems like a very good closing thoughts.
Yeah. So the way we do it is we end with you reading the poem one more time, with almost in like a new light, a new context, and discuss what we've discussed. And after that, we'll say our goodbye. So whenever you're ready, you could, if you would like to read the poem one more time for us, that would be lovely.
Perfect. The crescent moon in January, the geese that flew above me in February, the gentleman who read Graham Greene on a stool by the corner shop, they all feel hidden away in the fog blown down Mount Grouse this morning. Laughter is in the cherry blossom, lost as sea foam at the beach, and the afternoon strikes up a conversation of formations, so I dance with the snowdrops popping with care around my street. At every uprise, I sense their glee, so I prevent myself from picking them. It is so magical to be in this illusion where time only spans across March, April, and May. Last spring, I wrote eulogies for the time I spent among zucchini blossoms and imagined a requiem read out loud when I laid among these zucchini blossoms. Nothing feels like skin like their flowers. My mother birthed a poet when hazels and anemones sprung, magnolias, daffodils, daisies, and thistle all scream in ecstasy whenever I grow older, but only now do I feel this need to rise. I worship rebirth. It is one of many reasons I am so fond of spring. So I'll melt away in the orange light of tomorrow's early morning with celibacy and celebration. It is a triumph to breathe for full day.
Okay, Amanda, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for submitting such a wonderful poem. And thank you for allowing us to publish it. This has been a really wonderful and engaging conversation.
No, you said really, really interesting things that I'll definitely take away with me.
Oh.
Well, I appreciate it so much.
No, seriously, I want to say genuinely thank you so much for doing this and for submitting and for coming on the podcast. And it's so enriching to hear people talk about their perspectives, and they can be so different, but somehow also true, you know. And you've had a really, really insightful perspective on the world of literature and the culture of literature right now. And I feel so happy that this opportunity is being taken by people, and to actually exchange our thoughts about the things that we all love, because I feel like that's what we don't do enough in this culture. And so it's really great. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, goodbye. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to read Amanda's piece, it will be up on our website in our spring 2026 edition. And we'll be here with a new episode every Sunday discussing all the pieces from the spring 2026 edition, which you can find at readingintoculture.com. Yeah, thank you so much for listening or watching or however you are consuming this podcast. And please follow us, review the podcast, give it 5 stars, give it 6 stars, give it 10 stars, tell everybody about it because it really does help. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.